Live from Jerusalem, Israel, we are J-Town. This podcast deals with Jerusalem, its unique culture, history. This monthly audio magazine spotlights interesting stories and people that make Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Our first podcast deals with the Sabbatical year, which is coming up on Rosh Hashanna 5782. This podcast contains 3 segments: how to prepare your garden for Shmittah, how to maintain your garden during Shmittah, and the last episode explains how to buy fruits and vegetables on Shmittah. This podcast is based on a book I translated 14 years ago called Mishpatei, written by Rav Reichenberg, who is the Rosh Yeshiva of the Institute for the Study of Mitzvot pertaining to the land of Israel. I received a haskama, or approbation, from Rabbi Zev Leff, the Rav of Moshav Mititiyahu. This podcast is not a halachic guide. If you have any questions, please ask your local rabbi for guidance. Hi Hanoch, how you doing today?
Yes, good morning. It's good to be back in the J-Town studio.
Yeah, it's good to be here. So, Hanoch, this final podcast is on how to buy fruits and vegetables on the Shmittah year. I've gone into Machne Yehuda, the local main market, and I'm really confused. I see all these fruits and vegetable stands, and some have certificates that say Yuval Nochri, some say Heter mechira, some even say Otzer Beis Din. What's going on here? Maybe you maybe you can trench out this whole, trench out this.
I'll try. Let's walk back a moment and understand why we have an issue with buying fruits and vegetables during Shmittah. The reason that this is an issue is because, as we mentioned in a previous episode, during the Shmittah year, any produce which grows in Israel, from the land of Israel, has the sanctity of the 7th year, and it's ownerless, essentially. It's available for whoever wants to take it, and it's forbidden, it's asur, to deal with it as merchandise, to buy and sell it. So obviously that presents a big problem when normally that's how we do procure our fruits and vegetables. We go to stores, we pay money, and we buy them. And now suddenly we can't buy them. So this is the issue. So how in fact do people buy and sell, or I should say procure fruits and vegetables?
Good word, procure.
During the sabbatical year. So as you indicated, there's been a number of methods that the halacha has suggested, various rabbis have suggested over the years, and I think we could break them down to about 4 different approaches.
Okay, so why don't you explain it to us, what they are?
Sure. One of them is called the Heter mechira, which means the permission to sell. And that refers to the selling of the land, as it were, for the period of the sabbatical year to a non-Jew. It is somewhat similar to the device you may recognize from Passover, where if you have a very large quantity of valuable chametz, if you're like a store owner or you have a large whiskey supply, you might sell that chametz, that leavened things that you're not allowed to own during Passover, you might sell it to a non-Jew for the duration of Passover. So in a similar way, this device was developed already 18 Shmittah cycles ago. Okay, so that's 7 times 18 Shmittah cycles ago. One of the main rabbis involved at the time was Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, one of the great poskim of Europe at the time. The yeshiva in Yeshiva University is named after him, Rav Yitzchak Elchanan. And he and other great rabbis at the time devised this method of allowing the early farmers in Eretz Yisrael at that time, Jewish farmers, to be able to continue farming during the Shmittah year while selling the land, as it were, to a non-Jew. Therefore, because it was owned by the non-Jew, the produce would not have the sanctity of the 7th year. And this has continued until then with the approbation of leading rabbis and of the chief rabbinate until today, and it will continue during this upcoming Shmittah cycle with God's help. And the reason this can be done is because, by almost all opinions, Shmittah is d'Rabbanan. It's only a rabbinical mitzvah in our day for various reasons. Therefore, there's room to be lenient. And these other factors, like those days starvation, in our days, just the fact that the people, if those farmers couldn't farm during this year, then they would may have to close their business down because they rent equipment on a long-term basis and things like that. So that is permitted to buy during this Shmittah year will fall under the rubric of the Heter mechira.
Okay.
Then there's other things. Is
there any opposition to this? This
Yes, but that's a good point. All these methods have opposition.
Sure, two Jews, three opinions. Why not?
Exactly. So there's always opposition, and that's why people do other things and hold by other approaches. So yes, some people say, how can you, what is it, selling a land? How can you sell the land? There's always opposition.
What's the second method of?
In no particular order. Let's go to the method that you mentioned called Otzer Beis Din. This is an interesting approach. As I understand it, I believe it is mostly based, I think, on the Chazon Ish. I should have just confirmed that, but a number of decades ago, this was devised, and as I said, I think it's based on a few chidushim and a few novelties that were imposed. But the idea is this: basically, the Beit Din, the rabbinical court, they market the produce at cost to the consumer. They don't buy the produce from the producers from the farms. They simply take possession of it because it's essentially hefker, it's ownerless. And they pay the farmer for his work, not for his produce, but for his work, as if he's just an employee of the Beis Din, picking the stuff, putting it on the truck, etc. So, and then they market it at cost. Sometimes that's why Otzer Beis Din things are sometimes less expensive, not always.
Do you have to do anything special with Otzer Beis Din as opposed to Heter mechira? Or
yes, that's right, because the Otzer Beis Din produce does maintain the Kedushat Shvi'it, the sanctity of the seventh year. So you have to treat it with the sanctity of the seventh year. The Heter mechira does not have Kedusha of the seventh year. Some people take it upon themselves as a stringency to treat it as if it had the Kedusha of the seventh year, even though it doesn't have to. You don't have to. But the Otzer Beis Din produce does. It in fact does, because it's coming from Jewish farms. They're not selling them to non-Jews like the Heter mechira. So yes.
So is this a very popular system as opposed to Heter mechira, or is this not quite as widely used?
Yeah, I don't know the stats. I think on a national basis, Heter mechira is probably used more because if you go to a normal supermarket, even like a not so observant area, the main food suppliers, the Tenuva and others, they're going to be relying on the rabbinate that's giving the hashgacha, the supervision to that supermarket, is going to be relying on the Heter mechira. So just in terms of numbers, it's the greater population. I would say the Heter mechira is the most widespread, but within the more observant communities, the more Haredi community and the Dati community, the Otzer Beis Din also has a respectable place. People like it. Some people think it's the best way to do it. Again, even though others say, it also has its issues, it has its halachic issues, and it's based on chidushim, and it's also not so clear. All these things are a little bit in dispute, but some people think it's really good, and it is good. I mean, I'm not trying to, say a preference, but I think it's Otzer Beis Din is a good thing to do.
And you said there was like another method?
Right. So then one of the traditional methods that was done here in Jerusalem over the years, and I say over the years, I mean even pre-state and going back, because the Jerusalem community here is a long-standing community, that is simply to buy from non-Jews. This is called yivul nochri, to buy from the non-Jew, to buy from the Gentile. And according to this approach, which you see, it has a similar aspect to the Heter mechira, which they both rely on this idea which is also, by the way, some dispute, but they rely on this idea that if the land itself, the farmland, is owned by a non-Jew at that time, then it does not have the sanctity of the seventh year. So some people simply buy from Gentiles.
Do they also import it from overseas, or just in Israel by itself?
Both. Wherever today that we have international markets, a lot of our produce comes from abroad, probably much more than in the past. Mm-hmm. So yes, they bring in from, which is nothing wrong. I mean, there's no halachic problem. Well, there is a halachic problem to export the produce of the seventh year to outside Israel, but there is no halachic problem to import.
It's interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah. So they import. Now, some part of the opposition, as you might expect to this, is they say, "Wow, here you're not supporting the Jewish farmer, and you are supporting the non-Jewish farmer who may or may not be your friend."
Right.
And you may, that doesn't seem like an intelligent thing to do. So that's part of the opposition to that approach. But you'll find a significant segment of the observant community will rely on this option of yuvul nachri, of Gentile produce, during the Shmittah year.
Right. And is there a fourth method?
There's a fourth method, a little more, I don't know, high-tech. Maybe high-tech, no pun intended. It's the raised platform.
Oh, that's so funny, the raised platform.
The raised platform, meaning you're not growing from the ground.
Mm-hmm.
According to most opinions, only things that are actually growing from the ground itself in soil have the sanctity of the seventh year. So they build a raised platform, maybe out of concrete or what have you, and they also cover it with a level of rubber or whatever it might be in between. And they have and sometimes a closed greenhouse, and they'll grow in there. That's called a
Matzah
menutak. Thank you. A disconnected platform, disconnected from the earth. And then, according to that opinion, that approach, there is also not the sanctity of seventh year, and you can just grow things like normal, as it were, and sell them like normal. And that's another approach you'll see. I think you're a little involved with that, no?
Right. My wife and I have an organic greens business for the last 13, 14 years from our house here in Hanoch. A little plug for us. If you want good food, good greens, very nutritious, organic, come to Goldest Greens. We'll set you up if you're ever in Hanoch. Our supplier Shmitta is a man who lives out in Ma'ale He said that the builders are going crazy. They are building as many greenhouses as they can. They feel they really want to cash in on this opportunity. I hate to sound very mercenary, but they're staking that there's going to be a very good year for them. Not for the other farmers, but not at least some of the farmers. I mean, there are also farmers that are giving up their land totally. They're actually being paid by organizations not to farm, and that also has been growing slowly since the beginning of the state. We've seen more and more farmers. It's not big, but it is starting to grow. Also, they just leave the land fallow and they let open their gates and make everything hefker.
Wow.
So you should. So everybody, if you do go to these places, and it says the sign says hefker are free, ownerless, don't mess up their equipment. Don't pick things. Don't destroy the fruit trees. I mean, just take what you need and leave. For these people, I mean, was their livelihood, and they hopefully come back to it after the Shmittah ends, God willing. So that leads us into another interesting question. Let's say I have a fruit tree in my yard. Am I also obligated to leave it open, put a little sign, ownerless, hefker, on my front door?
If you have in your garden just one little lemon tree or something?
Yeah, lemon tree or an apple tree or maybe a grape, like grapevines will have some fruit hanging down. Do I also have to do this during Shmittah year?
I believe so, yes. I think even if you have one plant or tree
really
that's giving fruit or vegetables, you have to make it accessible to the public. You have to put up a sign. You don't have to have it 24/7 open, but you have to put up a sign, say, my garden, my orchard, my tree, whatever it might be, will be available for the public to take as they wish because it's ownerless on Yom Sheni between 9 and 11 in the morning, for example.
So it's like first come, first serve. Whoever gets there first and picks it. I believe so.
I think there's some preference for the poor and whatnot, but in theory, yes, anyone could take.
Wow. What about making compost? Let's say I have a lot of scraps, garden, buy vegetables and peels, and let's say they have kedushat shvis on them. Can I compost them and put in my garden and make compost during the sabbatical year, the Shmittah year, or is that kind of frowned upon?
My understanding, although it's a little counterintuitive to me, but my understanding is that most of the rabbis would say during Shmittah, don't compost those peels and other leftover waste from your fruits and vegetables with the sanctity of the seventh year. And because that's considered perhaps a little degrading, or it's going toward eventually, if you're growing other things, it's not in the spirit of Shmittah to be thinking about growing other things, not to be planning for it. So they advise during this year, even if you like to compost, I think compost is a nice thing. I encourage it generally, but during the Shmittah year, they say no. Just throw it out normally, don't compost it.
So I guess most rabbis would sort of come on the side where you can't use these peels that have a certain sanctity because it's sort of degrading them, as you say. So I have an interesting question. Most of what we've been talking about deals with places in the land of Israel. Let's say I'm in New York and I happen to see a nice fruit stand. I see some luscious Jaffa oranges. And they're from Israel. They're grown in the Shmittah year. What can I do? Should I buy them? Should I not buy them? If I do buy them, do I have to treat them with the same sanctity as I would if I was living in Israel?
Yeah, that's an interesting question that can arise in our modern economy where produce is sold all around the world from so many other places. As we mentioned a bit earlier, it's actually forbidden to export fruits and vegetables that were grown during the seventh year in Israel to outside Israel. However, as a number of things that are forbidden but nevertheless sometimes happen, you could nevertheless perhaps be in a supermarket in America or in England or where have you, and see, as you suggested, some fruit that is marked grown in Israel. So what do you do when you're in that situation? So I think there's different opinions. It's not a clear-cut situation. In terms of the sanctity of the seventh year, I believe, yes, its sanctity is not affected by the fact that it is now against its halachic will, so to speak, been kidnapped and taken to Chutz La'aretz.
Never heard that term used before, against its halachic will and kidnapped to Chutz La'aretz, but I'll go with that.
Right. So if you have this kidnapped orange there in Lakewood or wherever it might be, so
get me home.
You still have to treat it with the sanctity of 17. That question: should you buy it? Shouldn't you buy it? Maybe you're ready to half a mitzvah to eat it because it has kusher, otherwise someone's not going to treat it with the sanctity of 17. So it's not so clear. Probably there's sides to say that you could buy it. There's sides maybe to say don't get involved. So whatever you do, you would have what to rely on. But certainly if you did buy it and you want to sort of connect yourself, it is a beautiful way in a certain sense of connecting to Eretz Yisrael and the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael and the sanctity of the seventh year. So if you did buy it, remember to treat it with the Kedusha Shriyas. Right. You mean you can't waste it. You have to dispose of the leftovers in a dignified way, as we indicated briefly. So that's what I would say if you're in that situation. What would you do in that situation?
I've heard from the rabbis that it is a mitzvah to eat kedushat shvit, the produce that's grown in the sabbatical year or this Shmittah year. It's actually a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah. The Rabbanan, maybe our days. Some people say it's Doraisa or Doraita according to the Torah. So
you would buy it?
Yeah, I'd buy it. I'd probably buy it because I like fruit. I'm a fruity guy.
Okay.
There are, just one other side, there are places actually in the state of Israel that actually exempt from the laws of Shmittah, like the Arava, Eilat, places near Gaza, places above Ashkelon and a little bit below, that are actually exempt according to the tradition. So people who grow in the Arava can grow, or Eilat can actually grow just like any other year.
So what you're saying, Michael, if I understand correctly, is that the geopolitical borders of the state of Israel as we have them today are not necessarily, in fact, they are not the borders for determining what and where produce has the sanctity of the seventh year.
Correct.
There's other more historical determinants which outline that map of where the sanctity of the seventh year applies. I see. So that's interesting. Thank you. So bear that in mind. It's not so. It gets more. The plot thickens.
Literally,
it gets more complicated.
That's true. It's always complicated, seemingly. So this is the end of the third and final episode of our podcast on Shmittah. I hope you enjoyed it. We enjoyed doing it. My co-host and friend Hanoch Layman. And just a little last aside, if you can and you do have a little extra meiser money, we suggest that you help support farmers that want to desist from farming their land, and people pay them a stipend every month to learn, or buy Otzer Beis Din, which I think is a very good idea, or things that are grown in hothouses, that sort of thing. I think that's a good way, at least in my opinion. Hanoch has other opinions, but we can still remain friends. See you later from Jerusalem, Israel.
Thank you. Yes, it's our final episode on Shmittah, but hopefully not our last episode.
That's
of
true.
J-Town.
That's right. If you have any interesting ideas, let us know. You can email me at Michael Doniger at Doniger, Michael Michael @gmail.com. Bye. Shalom.